I'm John Buckley. I'm a Lecturer 1 in the English Department Writing Program.
And I'm Sarah Rovang. I'm a Lecturer 1 at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning.
So, Sarah, welcome to
Thank
WLEO. This is not the WLEO office. This is not a radio station. This is just a video. What's your current appointment at the University of Michigan? Are you able to work full-time?
I am, yeah. I have a 2-2 appointment. I'm a Lec 1, and 2-2 in my department, which is architecture, constitutes a full load.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so it's a pretty good deal.
That's a great deal.
Yeah.
I think I'm three for me in LS&A to be a full load. And of course, if I were in Dearborn or Flint, I would be teaching 4 classes to get a full load.
Right.
How did you become a U of M lecturer?
Very fortuitous circumstance. I had moved to Ann Arbor in 2015, and I was working and finishing my dissertation here remotely. My spouse had been hired as a postdoctoral researcher in the physics department on a 3-year position. And so I was just sort of here hanging around. I was fortunate enough to start a research collaboration with a tenured faculty member in the architecture and art history department. And through that connection, I was able to sort of reach out to the architecture school, and it just so happened that 4 tenure or tenure track faculty were going on leave or sabbatical simultaneously. So, I don't want to undersell myself, but I kind of walked in and they said, we'll hire you.
Right.
So it worked out really well for me, but they did hire me a second year to teach another full load, so I feel very fortunate for that.
Because I know you've got a background in Rhode Island and New Mexico too, right?
Yeah, I'm from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I did my graduate work at Brown University.
Yeah. What are your particular academic and professional interests?
So broadly, I teach and study about the architecture of the United States in the 20th century. But more specifically, I wrote my dissertation on the architecture of the Rural Electrification Administration, which was this New Deal program that brought electricity to farming populations primarily through cooperatives. And they hired this really kind of out there socialist European immigrant architect who did these radically modern buildings in the middle of rural America. So that sort of intersection of modern architecture, technology, and agrarianism is really sort of where my primary interests lie right now.
Would that be like the Hoover Dam, but Hoover Dam on Route 66?
Yeah, kind of like that. So yeah, I'm also interested in the Tennessee Valley Authority and some of these other really big government projects from that same period.
And speaking of projects, can you tell us something about the H. Allen Brooks Traveling Fellowship?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a fellowship that is sponsored by the Society of Architectural Historians, which is the professional organization that I'm primarily associated with. And it's basically this really unique opportunity for an emerging scholar to travel for an entire year with very few strings attached. My only obligations are a monthly blog post and uploading 500 images to the Society's database that they have sort of started as a way of compiling architecture from around the world.
And it's a year-long deal?
Yeah, it's a year-long deal, so I'll leave in July of this year, and I'll come back late June of next year.
Wow. Where are you going to go?
I'm going to Japan, Chile, South Africa, Central and Western Europe, Scandinavia, and the UK.
Is that going to be weird because so much of your research has been U.S. based?
Well, that's exactly why I made this proposal, because so much of my knowledge is about the social and cultural context of the United States, that I wanted to experience what industrial heritage is like in other parts of the world as well, because the sort of architectural and cultural modalities of modernization are quite different, of course, in different parts of the world.
Sure. How did you decide on the countries that you were planning on visiting on the fellowship?
I chose ones that had a really interesting relationship to industrial modernization. Obviously, there are some very expected places like the UK. Clearly, we associate the UK with the Industrial Revolution. But the way that industrialization played out in Japan, Chile, and South Africa is quite different. And I'm really interested in how that manifests architecturally on the ground. And then secondly, how that's being interpreted for public audiences. Because my hypothesis is that industrial heritage sites are treated very differently as tourist attractions in different parts of the world.
Too awkward a question. How many people were in contention for this fellowship?
You know, I really don't have any idea.
How big a deal are you, Sarah?
I mean, it is an international competition.
Oh, wow.
And this is the only the 5th year it's been awarded. And so I'm only the 5th recipient, but it's one per year. And last year's recipient was from Nigeria, so we have a sense there are people from all over the world applying for it. So I feel quite honored to be selected.
Yeah, wow, no kidding. How did you first hear about the lecturer's employee organization?
At the faculty orientation, where Matt came and gave a presentation, and I immediately signed my card. But it took me a while to sort of get more involved.
Yeah. What made you decide to get involved with Leo?
So I decided to get involved sort of to the end of last school year, in part because I just felt motivated because of my previous knowledge of unions coming out of my dissertation. I was really interested in labor movements and knew a lot about how historically unions have advocated for better living wages and better working conditions for people across a variety of trades. So part of it was just purely personal interest. And also part of it had to do with the outcome of the 2016 election. I was really looking for a way to become more politically active and involved, and Leo provided just a very easy sort of entree into that. Its connections to AFL-CFO and the American Teachers Federation really provided a way to sort of get a broader view of things that are happening around labor in this country, and maybe even as you mentioned, internationally.
As we bargain for a new contract, what are some of the issues most important to you?
I think one of the issues that's most important to me is salary. Not necessarily my own salary, although of course it could be higher and that would be fine, but I think people in general in this department are doing okay. But when I learned that people in Flint and Dearborn are teaching 4-4 loads for $28K a year, which is barely more than I made as a graduate student, that's in no way a living wage, and people working on that salary have to make really hard choices. And so I think making sure that salaries are up at a level where teaching as adjunct labor is sustainable is really critical. And then the second thing that I'm really concerned about is childcare, and subsidized childcare, and parental leave. I don't have a family yet, but there are a lot of other young Lex in this department who do have families, and for them, the fact that they are trying to raise a family and still support themselves as a lecturer is not something that currently is very tenable.
Switching from the serious to the silly, if I can channel Barbara Walters to some degree. If Leo were a building or an architectural style, what would it be?
I think it would be a really sort of solid brick public works administration building from the 1930s. And in the lobby there would be a big mural series called something like Triumph of the Lecturer.
Okay, awesome. Diego Rivera.
Of course, yeah.
There we go.
Only the best.
That's great. What do you think non-architects understand least about architects?
I mean, this is something I'm still learning because I'm not really an architect. I'm an architectural historian who works in an architecture department. But I think one of the things that I have really realized working here is that most architects and most lecturers in this department maintain a separate design practice outside of teaching. And for this discipline, that design practice really is tantamount to research. And that research, of course, is not part of the contract. It's something that people feel passionately about and choose to do anyway, on top of whatever teaching responsibilities.
That's why I still write poetry and publish poetry.
Exactly.
It's the working,
Yeah.
It's the work. What do you think your students understand least about lectures?
Well, I think that most of my students just don't have any sort of conception that they are existing within this two-tiered system where there's tenure track and there are lecturers, because especially out in the architecture studio, lecturers and tenure track faculty are sort of teaching alongside each other, and there's really no very obvious distinction made. And I think one of the harder parts I've found about trying to tell students about this two-tiered system is to explain that there's not the disparity in pay and benefits between these two tiers is not necessarily related to skill and experience. It comes out of the fact that we are living in an academic system where increasing numbers of people with graduate degrees are pumped into the system. And universities with this two-tier system like UM are basically exploiting that status quo to create surplus revenue.
Is a similar two-tier system in place in the architectural field?
Not really, or at least not that I know of. How?
Just in the same way there may be architects who are considered, realer, the true professionals, and then there are the journeyman architects that would be akin to lecturers.
Well,
even though both sets have
yeah.
advanced degrees, experience.
I mean, the discipline of architecture historically has been seen to be driven by these sort of iconic figures. We remember the Frank Lloyd Wrights and the Le Corbusiers of the world. But what we, I think, tend to forget is all of the other people who had to participate in those offices, in an office practice, who contributed their labor to the sustenance of whatever creative endeavor was being headed by someone with a really iconic name. I hate the term starchitect, but I think it exists for a reason.
Right.
Because it is still sort of descriptive of the way that we talk about how architecture is done, which is really disconnected from the way that design is actually accomplished on a large scale.
And maybe this will be my last question. What's one question that no one ever asks you, but you wish they did?
Well, I'll answer that question to start by saying that a question that I get asked a lot that I get frustrated by is who my favorite architect is. Because when you're an architectural historian, you know not only about all of the sort of creative genius work, but you also know about all of the buildings with leaky roofs, you know about all of the personal indiscretions, and it's sort of hard to separate that sometimes. So I think the question that I would like to be asked is, in whose office would you have worked if you were a historical architect? Who would you not mind working with?
Sarah, in whose architectural office would you not mind working in?
I would either say I.M. Pei.
Yeah.
He's just sort of a consummate gentleman of the sort of heady egos of the late 20th century. I think he has extreme humbleness in the way that he presents himself. Or Eero Saarinen. I would also just like to, as a Michigan guy, I'd be interested to see how his office ran.
A funny trivia bit to close us out on. My stepfather, Bernie Smith, for a long time had a very ugly rug in the house that he and my mother shared, which he was given by Eero Saarinen.
Wow. Small world.
Small world. But it's getting smaller. and Leo.